April 30th, 1789. The morning dawned clear and crisp in New York City. The 33,000 people living in the city flooded the streets as a yellow coach pulled by 6 white horses made its way to Federal Hall. Inside was the hero of the Revolutionary War, General George Washington. He was about to become the first president of the United States.
Of all the institutions that the framers of the Constitution created, the one that was the most novel was the presidency. And I think the reason for that was that there was no real model out there in the 18th century world. So a lot was left open about the nature of the presidency.
At the time that the office was created, most countries lived under monarchies. So they were wrestling a lot in the early days with how to deal with these basic questions of power.
The question began at the end of the American Revolution, when it wasn't certain what kind of government the newly free country would have, or what part of it would have the most control.
These people are professional politicians, but what they don't have is experience in creating a national government. They only have experiences at the colonial or state level.
And the whole thing is one big experiment. Nobody has done this before. This is a group of what could have been little countries, but now are united under a new constitution.
At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the delegates couldn't agree on how much power a president should wield.
Most of the states had presidents who were no more than figureheads. Not surprisingly, when the delegates to the Constitutional Convention arrived, a lot of them had that sort of thing in mind.
The original men who wrote the Constitution did not think the presidency was all that important. For them, the heart and soul of a republic was the Congress.
Congress represented the states, while the president would be a centralized, singular power. A heated debate circled the new position. The amount of authority it received would determine the balance of control in the government.
Well, the Founding Fathers claimed that King George III was an abusive executive. So they didn't give the president a lot of unilateral power. They established strong courts, a strong legislature, and a relatively weak chief executive.
They really wanted the executive to be the agent of what the legislature would instruct or tell the executive to do.
In a world of monarchs where bloodlines determined leadership, this new democracy also faced a unique and important question: how to choose a president.
It was generally thought that ordinary Americans would not know the candidates, would not know who they were. So what would an ordinary farmer in upstate New York know about some candidate for president? Almost nothing.
The delegates instead set up the electoral college system. Each state got a different number of electors based on how many congressmen each had. The electors themselves would be chosen by a popular vote in each of the states or by their legislatures. But tension among the delegates was still high over who would be the first to hold the office. The question threatened to doom the convention until George Washington agreed to run.
One of the things that reassured skeptics about the whole idea of a stronger federal government was that George Washington would be the first president.
They knew that Washington would not try to become king because he had already walked away from that possibility at the end of the Revolution. And so it was that genius for renouncing power that ironically ensured Washington would be the first president.
The first presidential election took place on February 4th, 1789. 69 electors met in their respective states and cast 2 ballots. The winner would be president, and the runner-up vice president. Washington swept the first ballot with all 69 votes. The winner of the second ballot, John Adams, became vice president.
When Washington was elected president, people didn't know what to call him.
His title wasn't a frivolous issue. It was symbolic of the debate during the convention of how much power to vest in the presidency.
John Adams wanted it to be almost regal, His Majesty the President.
Washington settled on a more modest title, His Excellency, the President.
Part of being His Excellency is that you don't have to shake hands. They would bow to each other. But part of this is because George Washington didn't like to shake hands with everyone.
It's not that he had a phobia about being touched. It's that there was a certain dignity, he thinks, that went with the presidency.
Whatever Washington did, nearly every action and decision took on special significance simply because it was the first.
Virtually every day of his presidency, Washington faced, should a president accept private dinner invitations? Should a president attend funerals? No one knew what a president was. And so Washington very deliberately sought the advice of people around him.
He, not surprisingly, thought he needed advisors. So he created this cabinet, but it was the group of people who were responsible to devise policy, to execute policy, to become his closest advisors.
The Constitution talks about executive officers. So the idea that there would be people in charge of the great departments of government wasn't a shock. The interesting part is that Washington ultimately decides to convene his executive officers and to meet with them.
Over time, the cabinet has grown from 4 members to 15, but its function has remained largely the same.
Washington brought the brightest minds of America together as his advisors, as a cabinet. He invented that. He could have chosen yes men. He could have chosen people who would, yes, whatever you want. But no, he brought together people who were brilliant in theory and brilliant in practice.
Thomas Jefferson was Secretary of State. For Treasury Secretary, he picks Alexander Hamilton. Then for Secretary of War, he picks Henry Knox, who was one of his generals in the Revolution. And whenever he has a decision to make, a policy decision or a decision about how he should do something, he consults all of them.
Washington spent his first year as president in the country's capital, New York City. Congress met at Federal Hall on Wall Street, while the president had an office and residence not far away.
Washington, D.C., there's nothing there. It's swamp, it's wilderness. Capital of the United States had been moving around. When George Washington is inaugurated, it's in New York City, and New York City hopes to keep it.
Southern states wanted the capital moved south between Virginia and Maryland. Northern states resisted the move, but they also wanted the federal government to assume the tens of millions in debt they'd amassed during the Revolution. It was the first battle between North and South, and the seat of government was the prize.
Hamilton really felt like if the national government couldn't take over all these state debts from the Revolution, then the national government itself really wouldn't necessarily have the authority to keep doing what it needed to do.
Washington agreed, supporting a compromise that would swap Northern debt for a Southern capital.
Alexander Hamilton, he makes a deal with James Madison, congressman from Virginia, and also Thomas Jefferson, and the arrangement is that the capital will move from New York City to Philadelphia for 10 years, and then it will go to a site on the Potomac River. So it will end up in the South.
Washington oversaw construction of the new federal city, hiring the planners who laid it out and the architects who designed the buildings. And he had very specific thoughts on the president's future home.
One of the aspects of architecture that he liked was the oval room. I mean, he made sure that that pattern was there in the White House.
Those ovals were incorporated into the new mansion, with the diplomatic receiving room, the blue room, and the top floor's yellow room. The first Oval Office would be added more than a century later by William Howard Taft. Washington's days were consumed with the business of the nation, his workday usually stretching from 4 a.m. until 3 p.m.
He actually had more people working for him at Mount Vernon than he did in the executive branch of government. There were 8 clerks that constituted the State Department. The first budget of the United States was about $2 million. The Army was a few hundred men. And yet, you can see in that impossibly remote culture the seeds of something much more familiar to us.